Okay, so I've got my piece cut out. I did decide to make a few minor changes just quickly as I was cutting, just because I was thinking that most everyone's going to be hand sewing this, so we could save some stitching. So my plan with this setup of the holster would be to do a double stitch along the shape of the weapon, a single stitch, and around the belt loop. So one of the things that I did is I came in a little closer here to this second stitch line, which I didn't draw in, so you can't really see it, but it's just right in here. So those two stitch lines right there are going to come awfully close, but that's going to be fine because we want a lot of support there. So by coming in closer here, I eliminated the need to sew around the holster. Also, I came in closer to the belt loop so that the stitch line supporting the opening for the belt loop will also close that side of the holster, so you weren't otherwise, with how I had it laid out before, which is fine on the machine, or if you have tons of time to do a lot of extra sewing, you're going to have a loop sewn around here and then a second line sewn around the edge. So now, by trimming down on this side here and trimming in closer to the belt loop, I'm able to only have one connecting stitch here and then another connecting stitch along this edge here. So we cut out quite a bit of sewing by trimming that down. Also, anything you can cut off of it cuts down the weight, makes it easier and more comfortable holster to carry. So sometimes easier is just better. Also, I came in and I just decided, because this came to a point, which is fine, but I just decided to round that off. One thing I didn't mention also is I like to cover as much as the weapon as possible. So you can see we're going to have almost all the weapon here covered. You do want to make sure that you don't get into the top sight though, just because that can snag on things, even if you do set up a sight line, because or sight channel, because the rear sight is going to be quite a bit larger, or wider rather, than the front. So our next step is we're going to make a back piece and a front support, which isn't very difficult. So in here, you probably have enough of the folder left to use that. If not, just take a second folder. Probably could have got that a little closer to the edge. All right, so we're going to do pretty much the same thing that we had done before. And again, I'm really only laying this out. I know I said this in the first video, but I've cleared and checked the weapon, ensured that it's safe and unloaded. Pencil. So this drawing doesn't need to be nearly as precise. The reason I'm back on the same, on the fold of the holster again, is because that piece is going to need to wrap around the weapon. So I've already got the fold in the crease of the folder, so I'm sure everything is going to be square from that point on. On this piece though, I'm going to be sure to come in and make sure I trace this entire trigger guard there, so that we're sure where that's at. All right, so from there, we're going to take and we're going to try to line up our pattern here as closely as we can. So all right, that's probably pretty good. Right about there. And I'm also going to line up my creases here. So my tracing's off a little bit there, but that's gonna be close enough. Okay, so at this point, we're just going to trace our holster pattern onto this. And we want to make sure that we get our loop in there so that we're sure that our belt is going to line up to what we're trying to do. And here, one small difference is we are going to go ahead and trace the other side of this holster. You can trace the whole thing, or you can just trace the line. It doesn't matter, or the top edge. But okay. So we know that we're going to have a belt loop on the back side of the weapon here, but it's very important that it lines up with our other belt loop that we already have in place. So, you know, we want to make sure that we get square to that. Make sure your cant looks good. And what we're going to do is we're just going to recreate this same line that we had drawn there. Other ways to do it, if you want to make sure that you're on target with it, is once you trace, fold your temple back in place. You can kind of put some guidelines there, so you're like, yep, that's where I planned for it to be. So in here, we're pretty good right there. Yeah, maybe up a little bit. Okay. Same thing on this side. So now we have a idea of where our belt is gonna fall. So next is we need to decide where do we want our belt loop on the gun. One thing to consider is you are going to have stitches on the inside. So this gun doesn't have many side features, you know, just the takedown and decock that are really going to have anything that might be covered by the holster. But you are going to have stitches, so there will be some rub against that from when you unholster and holster the weapon. I normally have never had any issues with that, you know, if you're using a good high quality thread. But also I will come in and I like to take my a slicker and just slick down over those stitches just to be sure. So don't have to reinvent the wheel, and when it comes to your belt loop hole, because you've already got one. So this is going to need two. So you can shape these out a couple different ways, but basically you just need an in and an out. So I'm going to put the in pretty close up here on the trigger guard. Yeah, probably right there. This also lets me line up the line I've drawn here to the original belt loop line that I've had here. So all that looks lined up pretty well. So this is gonna come in there. And again, I'm just laying out positioning for where this loop goes. This actually isn't the loop itself. The middle part is clearly going to be the loop. The width of that back part of your belt loop very well may depend on the size of weapon that you're carrying and how much support that you need. You know, but generally, an inch is plenty. So from there, I might have that too low. Yeah, we could probably move that a little bit. I'm gonna move that a little bit further back just so I got an idea. Again, you can draw it out, or you can just kind of estimate. Yep, right there looks good. So I'm just gonna come perpendicular to there. If you want your loop to be a little wider, you certainly can. So I'm coming up here and I'm going to wind up just close to that edge there, so that should be fine. So we're going to just trace that line out for where we're at here. Now, one difference is we are going to also need stitching room. So from this loop, this piece of leather, I'm actually going to go ahead and take it all the way up to the edge of where my holster is going to be. And this is the side you're going to need the loop on. So we're just going to line up right there. That looks good. All right, so that's where the, give or take about where it's coming out. So we can doctor that up a little bit. All right, so on here, this piece is going to come around and just follow right along with the carpenter pencil. May not be the best choice here. It's just what I had laying around. And where it comes down. So we can see that this, about where that is coming just to the trigger guard. So that's going to cover the opening to the holster. There's no need to go any further past that. You don't really need a large piece here or anything to make this very sturdy, you know, just because, you know, especially depending on the weight of leather that you're using, I would recommend, you know, at least a 4 or 5 ounce for a light weapon. If I'm carrying if I'm making something for a larger weapon, I like to use heavier leather. You know, most often than not, I'll use a 8 to 9 ounce leather on most of my holsters. When we come off of this side, again, we're going to have enough room to make sure that we can stitch a block in there, at least to cover that. So I'm just kind of free-handing some stuff here. We're also going to make sure that we have a stitch line. So if you want to be consistent in your stitching, you know, you can come in and measure what you've done, what you set up for your estimate for your other stitch lines, or honestly, you can just, if you're going to use your stitch groover to set that distance, and you've already got your distance set on your stitch groover, there's no reason you can't just use that. So, and then we're going to add a little bit because over there. So I'm going to have my stitch line come right in through here. So you can see this is going to come up a little bit on the edge of that holster. Some people like to sew in around that, but I certainly wouldn't. It's just decorative. All right, so that's about where I'm going to set up my stitch line on this. So I need to make sure, and all I'm really doing here is making sure that wherever I draw this line, that I have clearance and enough space to put my stitches. So it's not necessarily locking myself in. This is where I'm gonna sew that line, but more just that I want to make sure I have enough room. So when I come over, I'm gonna come in pretty close to that line, so that way I don't have to put in a second stitch or anything like that. And I just kind of loop it around. Some people like to have a larger area here. I don't. I like it's easier to mold and shape that holster. If this isn't, you know, huge, you could just literally take this whole piece and put over, and there are certainly some designers that do that. I like to limit this. It gives me more area to mold in the holster, because remember, this is where our chamber is, and that's where I'm going to hold most of my retention on the gun. So that is pretty much it. So then we're just going to cut this out. So when you go in to sew this, just so you know, I'm going to sew in on this edge, and then of course all the way around through here, and I'm going to come back to here. And so then I'm going to have a second stitch line sewing this piece down to there. They're going to join here and form the stitch line coming there. I'm going to have a trail off just to loop that in to make sure that holds secure, and then also that comes around here and then back to that piece. So I'm trying to eliminate as much sewing as I can. So pretty much we're just going to cut that out. Look for the knife that's in my hand. a lot of times I find that once I start cutting, I realize let's move that line over there, let's move this line over here, and that's fine. You know, again, this is a lot of trial and error when you're working in something that's custom. But what it allows you to do is to build the holster or make the holster that you want, and get it the way that you like it, not the way that somebody else thinks that it should be, outside of safety factors. Obviously, you know, when you're doing leather work, making a holster has a great potential for harm or risk than making a bag or something like that. So most important part, I know I see a lot of holsters that are formed that are trying to place tension on the weapon at the trigger guard, which as long as you stay really close to the front of the trigger guard is fine. I normally do very little molding around the trigger guard itself. You know, the last thing you want to do, especially if you're selling this to somebody, is for them to holster that weapon with one in the chamber and it go off. If you're a holster maker, that would not be good for business. Okay, so here we've got our piece cut out for that, and of course I would go and cut out the loop for there as well. Oh, one more thing I will show. Again, I do most of my sewing on the machine, or I set my distances on a stitch groover for when you go to sew it, which is all fine. But if you prefer to make sure all your holes line up and you're really particular about that, you know, there's nothing that sets you from going and taking your punch and just going and punching your holes where you want them in the template. And I do it folded over, that way that they all line up whenever I bring this holster together, so I don't wind up, you know, like off in one spot or the other. And then whenever you go back and you're going to transfer this pattern over to your leather, you can take your stitching awl or something and or pen and just mark those holes of where you're going to be punching, especially if you're going to be doing the hand sewing. One other thing that I do as well on holster making, just as a side note, the glue that you use is more important than the stitches. Well-constructed holster doesn't need stitches. This sewing, you know, it can hold it together on its own fine, but I would recommend a good quality barge cement is what I typically use. It sets up quick, it holds really strong, so make sure you scuff both sides of the leather, brush on in small thin amounts to both sides, and then press it together. Clamps are ideal for that. I always keep clamps of some kind around to hold the leather while I'm letting that set up. But once it's glued in place, it's much easier to come in here and do your sewing as well. And again, I'm not sewing there, I'm just sewing through there. So that's how I make a pattern for an Avenger holster. Pretty quick, pretty simple. You know, you can always double check. You know, the one thing about a manila folder is they're cheap and they're plentiful. So you can actually set that up, make sure that you're going to have clearance and be able to get that in. Make sure that you don't have anything. So like right there, I might be a little bit, that's too far. Okay. So yep, I'm going to have clearance all the way around. I'm just making sure that I can kind of pinch those pieces together. And again, I like it to be tight, because if you're going to wet mold the holster, the stretching of the leather helps. But we might do that in another segment. All right. Thank you very much.